Hello, POL371. This is Raheem. I trust you're all doing well this week. Today we are going to take on a topic that is one of the more fascinating and I would argue one of the more important of this entire semester. We're going to look at the implications of economic development for gender relations within a given society and for gender equality in particular. We're going to look at the very complicated and contested relationship between empowering women and developing economies, which is often portrayed as more simplified than it actually is. So in particular, we're going to take a in-depth look in a 2012 literature review by Esther Duflo, one of the world's most respected authorities in developmental economics, on this very contested and convoluted and still quite unclear relationship. So we'll look at some of the gaps in the research agenda and some of the research findings that Duflo pointed out and their implications for gender and development as a whole. But just getting started. So we can make I think a reasonable inference that poverty is sexist. That women have a gap in terms of economic resources, economic development, economic opportunities in all countries across the world. So even here in advanced countries like the United States, you have a persistent and stubborn income gap between men and women, despite the rise of working women. So women are consistently paid less than men at similar levels of qualifications for similar work in similar industries, despite the fact that women make up now 40% of the global non-farm labor force, and that number has been on the rise, and women also produce 50% of the world's food. So despite women now contributing their fair share to global economic output, this rise in productivity has not been equalized or has not been met with a corresponding rise in incomes and economic resources allocated to women. And this gap is especially prevalent in the domain of education. 2/3 of the world's illiterate are female, despite recent advances in the number of women who have access to primary and post-secondary education. That gap has persisted. And most distressingly, there are between 100 million and 160 million missing women worldwide. So there's a persistent gap between what the number of women globally should be if you go by models created by demographers and demographic predictions and the realized numbers of women across the world. And this number grows by a rate of around 6 million each year. It's estimated that a quarter of this gap is created due to gender-selected abortions, as well as infanticide. So this reflects the persistence of preferences for boys within families in a number of different parts of the world, most prominently and the largest in terms of numbers in China and India. So we'll get into that as well. So to identify and attempt to address the gap in gender well-being and gender opportunities, the United Nations Development Program established in 2010 a Gender Inequality Index, or a GII, to work as a companion to its Human Development Index. And this tracks gender-specific domains of development, particularly maternal and adolescent health, as well as female access to education and the labor market. So these three dimensions combine to create the Gender Inequality Index. So here is a map of the world in terms of gender equality. So as you can see, Western Europe and Scandinavia, the areas marked in dark green, are where gender equality has come the furthest. The United States has a pretty dismal ranking of number 41 in the world, which lags quite substantially behind its Human Development Index ranking. So where the United States tends to lag behind other developed countries in terms of women's empowerment we have a relatively high rate of maternal mortality and infant mortality due to a lack of reproductive health services in the United States and the politicization of reproductive health here in the United States. And we also have relatively high rates of teenage and adolescent pregnancies. So I'm going to blame that one on MTV's Teen Mom. I think that's where the blame should be allocated there. But in any respect, the United States, we also lag behind a number of other developed countries in terms of women's representation in political office. So presently, about 19% of office holders in the United States at the level of Congress or higher are female. So this is, it's about a quarter across developed countries. So this is another area where the United States lags behind. So the United States, in terms of the gap between women and men, is not looking so hot versus other developed countries. It's an area where we're lagging, in an area where it can be argued that policymakers here in the United States need to place more of an emphasis and need to prioritize to a greater degree. So despite the persistent inequalities between men and women, we are seeing, even in a number of developing and emerging economies, something of a feminization of labor. So as countries like India and China and Bangladesh have developed, they've created new sectors of their economy which tend to be more friendly to women, that tend to reward and emphasize skill sets that women have. So women have proven to be quite adept in domains like light manufacturing and textiles. They tend to have more better fine motor skills and more physical dexterity than men. So they've tended to be very successful in these types of fields. Another area where they've been successful are communications and call centers in particular within India. And they're viewed by employers as not only productive employees, but also relatively cheap and reliable employees. They're viewed as less likely to organize, less likely to bargain aggressively for higher wages. And there's less pressure on companies to provide women a breadwinner wage. Multinational corporations and even national corporations still tend to adhere to a kind of stereotyped view of male and female labor. Male workers are viewed as needing to earn a wage to support a family. A woman's salary is typically viewed as something that she earns on top of the salary needed to support a family. So it's viewed crudely in circles as quote-unquote lipstick money. Despite the fact that empirically speaking, women are more likely than men to use all or part of their income to support their families. More of women's income, empirically speaking, goes to supporting other members of their households than does men's income. And we'll get into that disparity as the lecture progresses. So Bangladesh, as Bangladesh has become more of a textiles hub, you've seen women as a percentage of the labor force increase substantially. So over the past 30 or so years, as more and more textiles, more and more clothing is made in Bangladesh, that's been a real boon for women's employment. Unfortunately, these increased and enhanced economic opportunities for women in the labor force, they've been met with a corresponding gender backlash. So especially in highly patriarchal society, we've seen a disturbing and increasing incidence of targeted violence directed in particular towards working women or women who are active in the public realm, women who are perceived as stepping outside of their place and outside of their prescribed role in society. So one really disturbing outgrowth of this phenomenon is a rise in acid attacks. So acid throwing, the intention here is to disfigure women. The intent here is to harm women's appearance, and it's on the rise, especially within South Asia. So there are somewhere in the area of 1,500 acid attacks that are recorded per year worldwide. And even more disturbingly, you've seen a type of misogynistic and anti-feminist rhetoric that comprises a lot of the propaganda of a number of terroristic entities, specifically Islamist terror groups. So one of the really big offenders in this respect is Boko Haram, which is a terrorist entity, is an Islamist group that is most active in northern Nigeria. The name Boko Haram quite literally translates to Western education is forbidden. So Boko Haram has been active in northern Nigeria for a number of years, but it came to global prominence in the year 2014 when Boko Haram militants kidnapped 276 female students from a government secondary school in Nigeria. This actually prompted the intervention of then First Lady Michelle Obama on social media, who got the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls trending on Twitter. So many of you will remember that situation from back in 2014. So in summation, you have greater economic opportunities for women in the labor force, but it's been met by a very disturbing trend of a gender backlash in a number of different patriarchal societies. So moving on to the article that I've assigned by Esther Duflo. So the name might be familiar to some of you. She is arguably the most prominent woman in the domain of economic development. She, as of this past year, became a Nobel laureate. So she was a co-recipient of the 2019 Nobel Prize in Economics, becoming just the second woman to ever garner that distinction. So in October of 2019, Duflo and two of her colleagues were awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics for their experimental approach to alleviating global poverty. So I have placed in the video description links to the banquet speech that Duflo gave at the Nobel Award ceremony, as well as her Nobel Prize lecture. So I encourage you to check those both out if you have an opportunity to do so. So those are both available in the link description. So I've assigned an article that Duflo published in 2012, which at this point gave a very comprehensive and thorough summation of the state of the literature on gender and development. So the question here is, to what extent is there a viable and self-sustaining relationship between women empowerment and economic development? So the way Duflo describes empowerment is through a set of improvements in the ability of women to access the core building blocks of development. So accessing things like healthcare, nutrition, educational opportunities, job opportunities, legal rights, and political participation. So these are things that Duflo viewed as the core ingredients to development. So any notion of a causal or contributing relationship between women's empowerment and economic development, it's really a question of two different processes. So does economic development in and of itself foster women's empowerment? So by this I mean, do gains for an economy as a whole ultimately accrue and trickle down to women and girls? So is it just a matter of developing and growing an economy and having gender equality take care of itself? Or is the causal arrow pointed in the opposite direction? to policies aimed at improving gender equality overall, so positive discrimination in favor of women, does that ultimately have a positive spillover effect to other areas of the economy? So looking at the first relationship, Duflo finds through her review of the literature that yes, benefits of economic development do trickle down to women and girls, but only up to a certain point. So families that are extremely poor, the lowest of the low, that on a weekly and monthly basis need to make life or death decisions, will often do so at the expense of female children. When there's not enough food to go around, for instance. It's often that girls will be the ones that are left malnourished or left without those critical life-sustaining resources. So it follows logically that relief from the most extreme situations of poverty will disproportionately help girls. The girl children who will, under circumstances of extreme poverty, be left to languish. Moreover, economic development, as countries move from low income to middle income, it creates a number of female-friendly job categories. So you can think about things like clerical work, we've talked about textiles, the types of light manufacturing that you're beginning to see come to the fore in places like China. One major boon to women's employment in India has been the advent of call centers. So things like tech support here in North America are increasingly outsourced to call centers in India. Those job sites have proven to be very friendly and quite amenable to women's employment. So you have women comprising a larger proportion of the workforce that works in call centers. However, even here in rich countries, so throughout the world, women are still excluded from the really high positions of influence on things like corporate boards, in areas of governance, political office, and this is kind of a global cultural issue that affects all countries. You have a very persistent and a very steep glass ceiling that operates not only at the level of the workplace, but also on a psychological level, that creates bias on the part of both men and women. And in the case of women and girls, especially in the case of young women, teenagers, young adults, this internalized bias often prevents women from entering high-income domains. So those domains here in the United States tend to be the STEM fields, science, technology, education, and math. There's a persistent and erroneous assumption that women are naturally less adept at math and the scientific fields than are men. So this has, quite unfortunately, it's limited the number of professional fields that women choose to enter. So Duflo actually makes reference to an implicit bias test. In her article, I've attached a link to that bias test in the video description. You can take that test yourself and see how you do. So due largely to this institutional bias and this institutional discrimination at the higher echelons of the economy, sort of on corporate boards, among executive offices and the like, the gender pay gap exists in all countries across the world. So the very best case scenario is in New Zealand, where women make 95 cents on the dollar as to what men make. So every single place you look at in the world, even in best case scenarios, women are less well compensated for the same work at the same level of qualifications in the same fields as men are. So the gender pay gap is something that at this point in history is universal. So economic development might it might fill in some of the gap, but even in rich countries, that gap persists. So that leads us to the next causal association. So actually starting with a very disturbing example of a potential negative relationship between economic development and gender empowerment. A rise in relative economic clout and relative disposable income in countries like China and India, coupled with the increased availability of things like ultrasound technology in abortion clinics, has led to an increased rate of gender selection and increasingly skewed gender birth ratios in favor of boys over girls. So as you can see, in both China and India, this problem has gotten worse over time as their economies have developed, and as households and families have gotten access to more disposable incomes. So when couples have more disposable income, it becomes relatively cheaper to terminate a pregnancy when you know that the child in question is going to be a girl. So this is especially a problem in countries where it's customary for a bride's family to pay a groom's family a dowry on the occasion of a marriage. So this is still quite a prominent practice in India and other South Asian countries. So this is something that Duflo points out, gender selection, sex-selective abortions, as a tragic case study in how economic development can have a perverse effect on gender equality if and when it increases the cost of discriminating against girls, especially prior to birth, especially in the womb. So you have a number of jurisdictions, including several states here in the United States, that have passed legislation that prohibits sex-selective abortion. This is a very controversial measure. It's still a subject of controversy in political discourses here in the United States. As I'm sure most in this class are aware, the question of abortion is a very politically charged one, especially here in the United States. But this is a measure that's nevertheless been under consideration, and it's been enacted in a number of jurisdictions here in the U.S. So moving on to the second causal pathway, to what extent do public policies and forms of positive discrimination that are geared to empowering women, to what extent do these in and of themselves spur development? So you see a lot of rhetoric surrounding the education of women and girls. So many of you will be aware of Malala Yousafzai, who's become something of a global ambassador for educating girls and having girls participate in primary and secondary and post-secondary education at higher rates. However, according to Duflo, most of the studies that have looked into the relationship between education and economic development are not especially well done. Most of them do not have strategies in place for disentangling the collinearity and the potential sort of causal, multiple causation between the selection effect of when girls are likely to pursue education and what underlying family and community factors will lead to that choice. So to this day, women who go to school tend to have certain unobserved advantages in terms of the families they come from, in terms of the communities they come from, etc. And most of the studies that look into this supposed link between education and development don't do a good job of disentangling those factors. Empirically speaking, the strongest findings about the effects of positive discrimination on development concern women's incomes and their household bargaining power. So within a marriage, within a household, women who contribute more, relatively speaking, to the household budget tend to have more control over household spending priorities. So for instance, more of the household budget is spent on things like food and maybe even women's clothing and women's appliances, or in sort of female-specific household appliances, as opposed to the proportion of the household budget which is spent on male-specific goods like tobacco and alcohol. So one potentially powerful tool is what's called a conditional cash transfer. So weekly or monthly cash infusions directed to a female spouse, to mothers, can very importantly alter a household balance of power, especially if these transfers are made without the knowledge of the male spouse, or if these transfers are placed outside of the reach of the male spouse or the husband. So here's a household bargaining model. For the most part, household bargaining, it occurs in a collective way, and it oscillates between non-cooperative and cooperative. So sort of because the household budget is a contested area, women who can bring more assets into the household in terms of both their income and the assets that they brought into the marriage tend to have more of a say and more power within this household bargaining framework. So this is one of the really cool frameworks to come out of the Duflo article and to come out of the literature on gender and development to begin with. So what are some of the really big findings and recommendations from Duflo? So Duflo finds that even relatively small cash infusions can have a major implication for the relative balance of household bargaining power, which in terms within a given household will shape spending priorities. So we've talked about conditional cash transfers paid to mothers. Obviously, opportunities for women in the labor market will perform much of the same function and have much of the same effect on the balance of power within a given household. Secondly, it's very important for societies to have a more evolved and a more egalitarian set of norms surrounding divorce and the dissolution of marriages. So in societies where women have recourse to divorce, they can divorce on relatively equal economic terms, and there's less cultural and social stigma surrounding being a divorcee. Women have a credible threat of exit from a marriage, which again enhances their relative household bargaining position, enhances their decision-making power vis-a-vis men and vis-a-vis their husbands. And finally, despite rhetoric to the contrary, a win-win approach is not always possible. So there's not always a tidy relationship between empowering women and growing the economy. Changes that help women and girls will often do so at the expense of men and boys. So one thing that Duflo gets into to a great deal are gender quotas for things like political office and corporate boards. So by definition, these quotas are taking away a position that would otherwise go to a man and allocating them to a woman. So despite this positive discrimination, which is not, I guess, squarely a question of merit, these are nevertheless an effective way to reduce an aspiration gap among young women. so girls and teenagers who are in communities where they see visible women leaders, are able to, on the basis of that representation, that visibility of representation, imagine brighter futures for themselves, and imagine sort of higher aspirations, and aspire to higher educational and higher professional outcomes for themselves. So it's that very visibility of having women in visible positions of influence and authority in society that really makes a big difference as to how girls and how young women perceive themselves and perceive their opportunities within society. So again, Duflo is known for her experimental approach to studying poverty. So one of the really cool natural experiments that she and her colleagues have been able to utilize is a very interesting quirk in how Indian village councils have been run. So as of the year 1993, India introduced gender quotas for all elected positions in village councils, as well as village council presidencies. So from 1993 onward, a third of all village council seats in rural areas in India, as well as a third of all presidencies of those councils, have been reserved for women. The councils that are assigned female presidents are rotated following each election cycle. So this creates a very interesting natural experiment for Duflo and her colleagues, in that you have an element of randomness introduced with this rotation. So the effects in areas with female presidents can be viewed as a result of having that female president itself, as opposed to any kind of cultural or geographical characteristics of that village. It's really an ingenious way to look at the treatment of what kind of effect will having a female president have on the distribution of public resources within these villages. It's actually probably this idea, and the execution of this idea was one of the major factors behind Duflo ending up as a recipient of a Nobel Prize in economics. It was a very ingenious and very novel and quite influential to this day experiment. So Duflo and her colleagues, by utilizing this quirk in the data in this natural experiment, have found that women-led councils are more responsive to complaints made by female villagers, and they invest more in areas that help women. So one area that's consistently been the focus of women-led councils in the provinces of West Bengal and Rajasthan, where Duflo and her colleagues observed these different village councils, have been investments in stronger infrastructure for the collection and the purification of drinking water. So Duflo hypothesizes that this is because in most villages, it's the responsibility of women to collect rainwater. And this is quite an onerous and labor-intensive activity. So in villages that develop better water purification infrastructure, the women and the girls have to spend less time and less of their labor on this very laborious and onerous process of collecting rainwater. So that's just one example of how a distribution of resources differs in having a women council president, and how women's leadership can matter in terms of how the requests and the priorities and obligations of women are responded to. And finally, there's been, among people who are sort of broadly in the universe of gender and development, there's been a lot of hype and a lot of false hope surrounding the idea of microcredit. So microcredit, which is most prominently practiced by the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, it comprises of a set of poverty relief schemes that grant small loans to the poor specifically for the use in a number of small business ventures. So these tend to be kind of DIY enterprises, very sort of informal family and community enterprises, things like agriculture, textiles, small shopkeepers and the like. Your typical loan will run for around the equivalent of $75 to $100 American. Quite importantly, there's no formal collateral required. So it's not as though a loan recipient will put up their house or put up a cow or some type of asset. These are collateral-free loans, at least in terms of physical collateral. But the mechanism of accountability that is implemented by microcredit firms and lenders is the practice of group lending. So loans are not distributed to individuals. They're distributed to multiple borrowers, usually 5 or 6 borrowers within the same community at the same time. So the idea here is that group lending will create a kind of social accountability mechanism in which the recipients of loans, they'll actively and consistently monitor one another. A lot of the time, loans will be contingent on mandatory weekly meetings for the recipients of loans. And it's quite important to note that these are loans, they're not grants. These are subject to interest rates, which can be as high as 20%. So entities like Grameen Bank, while they are geared towards helping poor people, they're geared towards impoverished communities. They're not doing so out of the goodness of their hearts in and of itself. These are entities that make profit, and they do so primarily by charging interest. So this is not charity. This is social enterprise. It's social entrepreneurship on all sides. Every entity is looking to draw personal profit and benefit financially from this arrangement. So globally, there are about 120 million current active recipients of microloans. Of this group, about 102 million are women. So about 85% of global microloan recipients are female. So entities like Grameen Bank started out initially catering to women. Women more so than men tend to be cut out of formal channels of credit. So women at this point in time had less access to conventional banks and conventional lenders. So this is where microcredit tried to fill the gap. So microcredit has a very attractive rhetoric. It has a very business-oriented and very individualistic rhetoric that is quite attractive to a number of the big donors who themselves are, tend to be millionaire and billionaire philanthropists. So the kind of business framing of microcredit has made it a very attractive and very sexy domain for these donors to get into. But I think sort of in the 35 or so years since the advent of the Grameen Bank, a general conclusion you get from systematic research is that the rhetoric and the hype surrounding microcredit is not matched by the results. That micro enterprises in and of themselves, over a long period of time, they tend to have suboptimal and diminishing returns for borrowers, and also there are a number of very problematic gendered implications of microcredit. So Duflo observes that giving women access to credit alone is largely ineffective, and it's largely a waste of resources when other barriers to market access remain in place. So for instance, poor property rights and women not having recourse to autonomous property rights, time constraints that are created by household and caregiving obligations. So again, a lot of the enterprises that are funded and financed by microcredit are kind of stay-at-home DIY crafting operations or sort of small business operations. Microcredit does less for women that are involved in the full-time labor market. Moreover, when you get into the logic underpinning microcredit, you find a lot of simplistic and problematic assumptions about women. So women are viewed as more altruistic than men. They're viewed as less likely to push back against creditors. They're viewed as more compliant. So a lot of these negative or a lot of these oversimplified stereotypes about women are channeled and they're reinforced through microcredit. So in microcredit, you have a highly gendered and arguably patriarchal set of assumptions and practices that are reinforced through the ruse of empowering women. Women are empowered, but only to a certain extent, and only within a very gendered paradigm of the appropriate types of work for women versus men. So again, microcredit tends to finance these small village enterprises, which are not especially profitable and not especially efficient over the long run. And finally, the notion of social collateral within villages, it's created a number of social problems, and it's sometimes led to things like social exclusion and social stigmatization in the event that borrowers cannot repay loans. At its most extreme level, this custom of social collateral has been linked to suicides in circumstances of extreme shame and extreme social ostracism that stems from an inability to pay back loans. So that group enforcement, that kind of peer pressure mechanism, can also be quite coercive and can also have very severe emotional and psychological effects on individuals who, for whatever reason, aren't able to pay back their loans or aren't able to get their enterprises up and running. It can be a substantial source of shame, leading in extreme cases to things like suicide. So the question I would like to leave you with, and that I will post on Moodle in the very near future, is as follows. Is positive discrimination necessary to level the economic playing field between men and women? Should governments, including our government, establish formal quotas for women's representation both in political office and in executive positions within corporate boards? So I'll post that question on Moodle. So again, this week onward, I will be grading your responses for content, and this will be the bulk of your participation grade. So I'll grade your responses as either excellent, good, or unsatisfactory. One final note I wanted to bring to your attention is that a few of you have complained to me about consistently getting notifications with each discussion board post. So I've set notification settings to optional. So you should be able to go to Moodle and unsubscribe from receiving message board posts. Please send me an email or contact me some other way if you have difficulties doing so. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you again for your patience with this entire process. I hope you found the readings as interesting as I did. I'm looking forward to hearing your responses. Have a great afternoon. Bye.